Famous pianist told a blind black kid to play piano as a joke. Turns out the boy's got an insane gift. Hey kid, how about you play something for us? I bet you know Happy Birthday. Vincent Sterling's voice boomed through the fancy hall of the Lincoln Art Center, and you could hear the snickers from all the big-shot New York music people in the crowd. 16-year-old David Thompson just stood there next to the Steinway Grand, gripping his white cane tight. Dead quiet took over the room real fast. The kid had come with his public school music teacher, who somehow scored 2 tickets to the most exclusive charity recital of the whole damn season. Vincent straightened his Armani tux, flashed a smile at all the rich patrons and music critics. At 42, he was supposed to be one of the greatest Chopin interpreters alive, sold-out world tours, million-dollar deals, the works. To him, this random blind kid standing there was everything wrong with inclusion at these fancy cultural events. Come on, don't be shy, Vincent pushed, voice thick with that fake nice condescending tone. I'm sure our generous donors would love to see how we invest in diversity. Ms. Patricia Wells, the director of the foundation putting this on, muttered something about it being inappropriate to her assistant, but she didn't actually do shit. Vincent Sterling was the star tonight, the guy pulling in millions for the organization. David took a slow, deep breath, fingers squeezing the cane harder. Nobody in that room knew he practiced 8 hours a day on a borrowed keyboard in the basement of the neighborhood church. Nobody knew that at 3 years old, he could already replay whole symphonies after hearing them just once. And nobody had any clue that right then, while they all saw him as some annoying problem, he was quietly locking in every single note, every chord, every little bit of arrogance floating around the air. Actually, David said, his voice calm and clear, slicing right through the side conversations, I prefer Bach. Vincent let out a real laugh. Bach, really? What piece you gonna play, young man? The famous pianist's smile was about to freeze when David answered with this scary calm vibe, like someone holding a bomb and knowing exactly when to drop it. Partita No. 2 in C minor. But maybe it's a little too advanced for this crowd. The silence after that was so heavy you could legit hear the old clock ticking out in the entrance hall. Something about how the kid stood there, the quiet confidence in his words, made a few people realize they were about to see way more than some quick humiliation. If you're vibing with this story of smashing through prejudice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch how one moment of straight-up mockery turned into the most brutal lesson the New York music elite ever got served. Vincent felt a little sting of annoyance at the kid's comeback. The Partita No. 2 in C minor was one of Bach's most brutal pieces, technically insane and emotionally crushing. It breaks even the pros. How dare this kid act like the audience can't handle it? Too advanced. Vincent snapped, voice getting sharp now. Young man, you're talking to people who fund the greatest orchestras on the planet. Maybe you don't get where you are. The crowd murmured in agreement. Margaret Rothschild, heiress to a banking fortune and the foundation's biggest donor, whispered to the guy next to her, how rude. Someone needs to teach this generation some manners. David didn't move, but the way he held his cane shifted just a tiny bit. His fingers weren't shaking anymore. They were loose, relaxed, like a surgeon right before cutting. Vincent, Dr. Harrison Webb, conductor of the Boston Symphony, cut in. Maybe we should move on to the main program. No, Vincent interrupted, clearly pissed at the pushback now. Young David here seems to think our guests aren't sophisticated enough. I think it's only fair he shows us this musical superiority he's hinting at. Vincent strutted to the piano and banged out the opening bars of the partita with big, dramatic, almost cartoonish arm movements. You see, David, this piece needs more than technique. It needs emotional maturity, something that takes decades. You sure you want to embarrass yourself like this? What Vincent didn't know was that David had memorized every tiny detail of that exact performance. For the last 8 years, ever since the car crash that took his sight and his parents, he'd poured every spare second into music, not as a cute hobby or some natural gift. It was survival, the only way he could deal with pain too big for words. His Aunt Deborah, who cleaned at the city's music conservatory, got him rare recordings and braille scores. David had swallowed hundreds of pieces whole, not just the notes, but every famous interpretation, every regional style, every emotional layer tied to each composer. Dr. Sterling, David said, purposely messing up the title, you played those opening bars in D major. Partita number 2 is in C minor. Ice-cold silence hit the room. Vincent's face went red. He'd switched the key on purpose to test if the kid actually knew the piece, but he never thought the boy would call him out in front of everybody. Obviously, that was intentional. Vincent lied, voice losing its smooth polish. I was testing his basic musical ear. I see, David said, calm as hell, making some guests squirm in their seats. Then you must also know Bach wrote this partita after his first wife, Maria Barbara, died. Every movement is a different stage of grief. That's why playing it right takes more than technique. It takes knowing real loss. The words slammed Vincent like a fist to the gut. His own version of the piece had always been technically clean, but cold, lacking the depth real experts always noticed, but never called out. Very good, Vincent said, his perfect mask starting to crack. Since you're such an expert on music theory, how about you actually show us? Or are you just going to keep flexing your Wikipedia brain? David walked to the piano, set his cane gently against the bench. His hands found the keys like he'd done it a million times in his head. One question before I start, David said, turning a little toward the crowd. Has anybody here ever lost everything they loved in one single second, and then had to rebuild their whole soul, note by note? The silence that time wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy with recognition. Some people started realizing this wasn't just a cute piano stunt. Vincent felt a cold shiver crawl up his back. Something about the kid's stance, the way his hands floated over the keys, screamed that the night wasn't gonna end the way he'd scripted it. What all those rich folks couldn't see was that every snide comment, every pity stare, every little dig was fuel. It was waking up the kind of power that only comes when suffering gets turned into straight-up purpose. And underestimating someone who's already lost everything? That's the dumbest move you can make. David's question just hung there like a note that never resolves, making people shift uncomfortably. Vincent's irritation was boiling over. Enough cheap philosophy, he snapped, all social politeness gone. Either play right now, or get out so we can do a real program tonight. Margaret Rothschild whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Honestly, I don't know why we let just anyone in these events. There's a standard to keep. David nodded slow, hands still hovering. You're right about standards. They matter. His voice had this eerie calm that made Dr. Webb frown, like he was picking up on something the rest hadn't clocked yet. In the fifth row, Aunt Deborah knew that tone instantly. Same one David used right before crushing impossible math problems or dropping something he'd been secretly prepping forever. She'd worked at the conservatory long enough to know her nephew wasn't just talented. He was on another level. Prodigy shit most people couldn't even wrap their heads around. David, Vincent pressed, patience completely shot. You gonna play, or what? 'Cause I promise nobody here's got all night for your deep thoughts. Actually, David said, shifting on the bench, I want to tweak the plan a little. Instead of partita number 2, how about something more educational for everybody? Vincent laughed, straight up mocking. Educational, kid? You're talking to people who bankroll entire conservatories. What the hell could you possibly teach us? David turned slightly toward the audience, blind eyes somehow cutting through all the fake smiles and masks. How about showing the difference between playing the right notes and actually playing music? A ripple went through the crowd. Some people looked confused, others straight up offended at the shade. How dare he? Patricia Wells hissed to her assistant. Like someone like him could tell real technique from whatever he thinks he's doing. Vincent felt the whole situation slipping. This kid was trying to flip the script, turn it into some big dramatic moment. Time to shut it down for good. Fine, Vincent said, striding to the piano. Since you want to give lessons, I'll show everybody first how the partita's actually supposed to sound when it's played by someone who's studied music. David stepped back from the bench, letting Vincent sit. What the famous pianist didn't catch was the tiny, almost invisible smile that flicked across the boy's face. Not nerves, but the look of someone who just maneuvered his opponent right where he wanted him. Vincent launched in with his usual flawless technique. Every note perfect, every rhythm locked and tight. Classic high-level playing built over decades of elite training. While Vincent played, David closed his eyes and did what he'd trained himself to do for years. He didn't just hear the notes. He photographed the whole damn performance in his head. Every tiny choice, every rubato, every micropause. Cataloging it all like ammo. Aunt Deborah watched her nephew, pride and worry mixing hard. She knew that focus. Same one he got when he'd spend hours dissecting dead masters' recordings like a crime scene investigator. Dr. Webb, third row, clocked it too. Something different in the boy's stillness. Quiet that reminded him of the greatest performers right before a career-making night. Calm that doesn't come from giving up. It comes from being ready as hell. Vincent wrapped the partita with a big showy finish, clearly proud of himself. Polite applause. Some comments about his perfect technique and mature interpretation. And now, Vincent said, standing up and waving grandly at the piano. Let's see how you handle a piece that's obviously way beyond you. David walked back to the bench. But before he sat, he did something nobody expected. He turned to the crowd and said, "Before I play, I want y'all to understand something about what you just heard." Vincent scowled. "What are you talking about?" "The partita number 2 wasn't just some technical flex," David continued, voice suddenly carrying real weight that made the whole room lock in. Bach wrote it as a conversation with grief. Every movement is a different part of mourning his wife, Maria Barbara. Some guests leaned in, actually curious now. The first movement, David went on, is denial. The music straight up refuses to accept she's gone. The second is rage, at God, at fate, at music itself for not bringing her back. Vincent rolled his eyes hard. Any first-year student knows that. You're not impressing anybody with basic history. David smiled again. This time it actually reached his eyes. You're right. History's easy to memorize. But feeling that pain for Real, that changes everything. He sat down, hands settling on the keys. The difference, Dr. Sterling, between your version and mine isn't technique. You played the notes Bach wrote. I'm about to play the tears he cried. The silence that dropped after that was different from all the others. Electric. Like everyone suddenly knew something wild was coming. In the fifth row, Deborah squeezed her fists tight. She knew David wasn't just about to play. He was about to rip his soul open in front of people who'd spent the whole night looking down on him. Brave as hell. Terrifying as hell. Vincent stayed standing right next to the piano, face flipping between pissed and nervous. Something about the kid's posture, the quiet sureness in every move, screamed that the night was about to go completely off his script. David took one deep breath and shut his eyes. In his head, he wasn't in that snobby room, full of people who hated him anymore. He was back in that hospital bed 8 years ago, waking up to the news he'd never see his parents' faces again. Never see anything again. When his fingers hit the first notes of the partita, something straight-up magical happened in that hall. It wasn't the same notes Vincent played minutes earlier. It was those same notes, but broken open by real pain, real loss, real grief that had rebuilt every piece of who David was. That's when everybody finally got it. They'd totally slept on this blind kid from the sticks. Not just his crazy skills on the keys, but the deep emotional shit he was carrying inside, and how he was about to take every bit of pain he'd ever swallowed and turn that humiliation into something none of them would ever shake off. The first notes that came out of that piano hit Vincent Sterling like a slap. He straight up flinched. Those weren't just the same notes he'd banged out earlier. Nah, they were the exact same notes, but reborn through a soul that had walked through hell and found some kind of light in music. David was playing that partita like he was straight up having a convo with Bach across time. Every phrase carried all his baggage, the brutal loss at 8, the rage at a world that only saw him as a problem, and finally that hard-won piece that turned music into something holy for him. My God, Dr. Webb whispered, leaning way forward in his seat. In his whole 40 years making music, he'd never heard playing hit this deep. Vincent's legs were literally shaking. The kid's technique wasn't just clean, it was better than his. All those tricky passages Vincent had to grind through, they poured out of David's fingers like pure water, effortless, like breathing. Margaret Rothschild, the same one who'd just clowned the kid's nerve, had tears ruining her perfect makeup. David's music wasn't only perfect on paper. It reached into places in her soul she'd straight up forgotten were there. How is this even possible? Patricia Wells whispered to her assistant, voice cracking for Real. The music itself answered. David wasn't just playing the partita. He was telling his whole damn story through it. First movement, that was the little kid who lost everything in a heartbeat. Second, the teenage fury of a dude forced to survive a world that judged him trash before it even knew him. Vincent just stood there frozen while his own version got taken apart and rebuilt into something way more powerful. Every choice he'd made for decades, technically right but emotionally dead, was getting exposed by this raw kid he'd tried to clown. When David hit the third movement, the whole room felt something shift. That movement about acceptance and rising above, it turned almost spiritual. David wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing through them, linking everybody in that room to the universal pain of loss and coming back stronger. "Vincent," Dr. Webb whispered, voice thick with straight awe, "this boy, he's one of the greatest natural talents I've ever seen." Something cracked inside Vincent's chest. Not just his ego, the whole damn fortress of superiority he'd built his whole life just crumbled. This blind black kid from the projects wasn't just better than him. He was better than anybody Vincent had ever known behind a piano. The room went dead quiet except for that otherworldly music flowing out. People who'd shown up just to flex their status were now face to face with something real, too powerful to ignore or talk down. As David built toward the climax, Vincent finally clocked how arrogant he'd been. Every movement showed years of grinding, brutal discipline, and an understanding of music that no fancy school could teach. This wasn't some amateur flash. This was genius hammered out in pain. "He memorized our whole damn conversation," Vincent muttered, the truth hitting like lightning. Every snobby tone, every nasty word. He knew exactly what he was doing. Deborah Thompson in the fifth row was smiling through tears. She'd seen David practice till his fingers bled, study Braille scores till dawn, memorize dead masters' interpretations. Now the world was finally seeing what she'd always known was in him. Vincent looked around and saw his own downfall staring back from every elite face. Margaret Rothschild watched him with straight disappointment and disgust. Dr. Webb shook his head slow, clearly rewriting everything he thought about Vincent Sterling. "How dare you?" Patricia Wells hissed, eyes locked on Vincent. "Try to humiliate a child with a gift like that." Vincent opened his mouth, but nothing came out. No excuse in the world could fix what he'd done. He'd tried to use his fancy position to smash a kid who was everything music's supposed to be: pure, real, life-changing. David finished the partito with this gentle touch that made the silence afterward feel holy. His hands stayed on the keys a second, like he was sealing a promise with the music he'd just set free. When he finally stood and turned to the crowd, no cocky grin, just quiet dignity from someone who'd bared his soul and knew he'd done right by Bach and his own path. The ovation that hit was unlike anything that room had ever seen. Not just clapping, it was apology, recognition, and celebration all at once. People stood like they were in church. Vincent stayed frozen, watching his reputation get rewritten live. Everybody there now knew he'd tried to crush a musical genius out of pure prejudice. In 15 minutes, David had wrecked the image Vincent spent decades building. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Webb said, walking up with disappointment and disgust all over his face. "I think we got a lot to talk about regarding your contract with the orchestra." Margaret Rothschild pulled out her phone, and Vincent already knew. The story of his humiliation was about to spread through the whole cultural scene before he even left the building. David walked right up to Vincent and stuck out his hand. "Thank you for the opportunity to play, Dr. Sterling. Sometimes we gotta hear our own music played back to understand who we really are." Vincent shook the kid's hand with shaky fingers, finally getting it. He'd just witnessed not only an insane performance, but his own total social downfall. While David got love from every big name there, Vincent Sterling, the dude who tried to use privilege to smash talent, learned that music, like justice, has its own way of balancing the scales. 6 months later, David Thompson was walking the halls of Juilliard as a full-ride scholarship student. At 17, he became the youngest ever to get a full ride in the school's history. Dr. Harrison Webb, who'd seen the destruction live, personally made sure David got the best shot possible. Talent like this comes once in a generation, he'd tell anybody who questioned putting so much into a kid from the projects. The practice room where David spent mornings looked out over Central Park, a far cry from the damp church basement where he'd first learned. But bigger than the view was the respect. Teachers didn't see him as a charity case. They saw a future master who'd own any stage. Margaret Rothschild, who'd laughed at him that night, now personally paid for his studies and started a foundation to find other overlooked talents in broke communities. "That boy taught me privilege without purpose is just waste," she told the New York Times. While David leveled up, Vincent Sterling's world fell apart. Contracts got canceled left and right. The video of David's playing, and the cruel setup right before it, went mega viral, millions of views, millions of comments ripping into Prejudice dressed up as class. Vincent tried Europe, but the story followed. Critics started questioning not just his playing, but his soul. Sterling plays the right notes, but his music lacks the soul we witnessed in that young prodigy, one big Guardian review said. Patricia Wells got forced out after the public saw how she'd let charity gigs turn into stages for bigotry. The board said associating with discrimination was a no-go, period. Deborah Thompson watched her nephew prep for another solo. This time at Carnegie Hall, as the main act, not some tolerated sideshow. She thought about how losing his sight had also unlocked a gift that might have never shown up otherwise. "You ever get mad about what happened?" she asked while David tuned his new Stradivarius on loan from the Rothschild Foundation. David smiled, fingers finding the strings like they'd always known each other. "Annie, Vincent Sterling gave me the greatest gift of my life that night. He gave me an audience." The irony wasn't lost on him. Vincent tried to crush what he saw as less than, but accidentally gave the world its first real look at true genius. On Carnegie Night, David played to a packed house, celebs, critics, and Margaret Rothschild front row, now one of the loudest voices for music inclusion. Vincent watched the live stream alone in his Queens apartment after losing the Manhattan penthouse. Every note was a reminder of his own crash. When David finished that same partita, devastatingly beautiful, he stepped to the mic. "Music doesn't belong to any of us," he said, voice ringing through the hall. "She exists to connect human hearts no matter our background or what we look like. That's the real democracy of art." The ovation lasted 15 minutes. People cried openly, not just for the music, but for witnessing something that changed everything. A reminder that real talent always finds a way, even when the world tries its hardest to stop it. 2 years later, David's first album dropped and became the best-selling classical record of the decade. Vincent Sterling now gives private lessons at a community school. His big international career? Done. Killed by his own arrogance. The difference wasn't just success, it was what they did with their gifts. David used music to lift people up, starting programs in rough neighborhoods. Vincent used his to climb over people until he learned heights built on prejudice always collapse. David Thompson's story is legend in music circles now, not just for the insane talent, but for proving real artistic greatness doesn't care about color, class, or the limits scared people try to put on it. Like David always tells young kids facing the same hate, the best revenge isn't destroying the ones who hurt you. It's building something so big they could never even dream of it. Have you ever seen talent get slept on because of straight-up prejudice? How'd you react when you saw injustice hiding behind tradition? Drop your stories in the comments and subscribe for more real ones that show true merit always beats fake privilege.